If you're like me, you're probably getting very discouraged, not just by the COVID-19 pandemic and its restrictions, but by the increasingly fearful and angry strife in our political, cultural, and social lives. Many of us are asking how we got here and how we might be delivered from all the pain and dysfunction of our current situation. While dealing with these questions, I was saddened last week by news that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks had died on November 7th of this year, following a brief bout with cancer at the age of 72. Rabbi Sacks was one of my favorite theologians, philosophers, biblical scholars, and social commentators. For 22 years, from 1991 to 2013, he was the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom, which made him a member of the House of Lords. Following his retirement from that position, he served on the faculties of several important American and British universities. He was an excellent writer and speaker, someone whose voice sounded like God. His books include Not in God's Name, Confrontations with Religious Violence, and The Dignity of Difference. His last book, however, was published just this year in the United States. It was titled Morality: Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. In that book, he addressed with great insight the questions I just mentioned from the perspective of an Orthodox rabbi and national leader. A free society, he says, is a moral achievement. It cannot be sustained by market economics and liberal democratic policies alone. It needs a third element, morality, a concern for the welfare of others, an active commitment to justice and compassion, a willingness to ask not just what is good for me, but what is good for all of us together. It is about us, not me, about we, not I. He continued, if we focus on the I and lose the we, if we act on self-interest without a commitment to the common good, if we focus on self-esteem and lose our care for others, we will lose much else. Nations will cease to have societies and instead have identity groups. We will lose our feeling of collective responsibility and find in its place a culture of repetitive, competitive victimhood. In an age of unprecedented possibilities, people will feel vulnerable and alone. The market will be merciless. Politics will be deceiving, divisive, confrontational, and extreme. People will feel anxious, uncertain, fearful, aggressive, unstable, unrooted, and unloved. They will focus on promoting themselves instead of the one thing that will give them lasting happiness, making life better for others. Our collect for the third Sunday of Advent, sometimes called Stir Up Sunday, also addresses our longing for the deliverance from the cultural, political mess we've created and seem unable to fix. It tells the Lord, stir up your power, because we are sorely hindered by our sins and are in need of help and deliverance. This is appropriate for us because in the waning weeks of 2020, we need deliverance from COVID-19, from political polarization and chaos, from violent protests and rhetoric, from uncivil public discourse, and from the alienation of family and friends. The writer of the 61st chapter of Isaiah, our reading this morning from the Old Testament, addressed similar issues by bringing good news to the oppressed. The Jews of his day, portraying a stunningly poetic, optimistic vision for God's people. According to one of the leading contemporary Jewish scholars of the Hebrew Scriptures, Robert Alter, Isaiah may be divided into 3 separate sections written at different times and probably by different authors. Today's text, according to Alter, is from 3rd Isaiah, which addressed the predicament of the Jewish community in the Persian province of Yehud, or Judah, after the rebuilding of the temple, probably in the 5th century BCE, before the decisive mission of Ezra and Nehemiah in the middle of that century. Listen to a portion of this text again. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display His glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. Their descendants shall be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge that they are a people whom the Lord has blessed. Note first that this vision speaks of becoming a people whom the Lord has blessed, not an individual. It sees a community of people and their common good, not blessings bestowed on isolated, autonomous individuals. Secondly, notice that this vision for the flourishing of God's people includes an everlasting covenant. Now, I have not been one of those Christians who has in the past gotten very excited about the concept of covenant as an important way of describing our relationship with God or one another. I'd always thought of covenant in self-interested transactional terms. God will do good things for us if we do what He says. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. This didn't seem very spiritual or altruistic to me, but I misunderstood. In morality, Rabbi Sachs rightly claims that covenant is a concept with immense transformative power and makes the following decisions. He says, contracts are about I. A covenant generates a different kind of relationship altogether. What makes it different is that in a covenant, 2 or more individuals, each respecting the dignity and integrity of the other, come together in a bond of love and trust to share their interests, sometimes even to share their lives by pledging their faithfulness to one another, to do together what neither can achieve alone. Unlike contracts, which are entered into for the sake of advantage, covenants are moral commitments stained by loyalty and fidelity, even when they call for sacrifice. They are about you and I coming together to form a we. A contract is a transaction. A covenant is a relationship. A contract is about interests. A covenant is about identity. That is why contracts benefit, but covenants transform. A covenant creates a moral community. It binds people together in a bond of mutual responsibility and care. It can be vast. There is, I believe, a covenant of human solidarity that binds all 7 billion of us alive today to act responsibly toward the environment, human rights, and the alleviation of poverty for the sake of generations not yet born. A covenant can also be small and personal. The simplest instance is a marriage when a husband and wife pledge themselves to one another in an open-ended commitment to share a life. I think Rabbi Sachs was onto something. The development of covenantal relationships and communities is surely one of the ways God can empower us to move from I to we, to heal our world, nation, communities, and families, to focus on the common good, and in so doing, fill our lives with more meaning and happiness. St. Paul, in today's reading from 1 Thessalonians, tells the Christian community in Thessalonica to, quote, encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing, and to see that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all, end quote. A striking example of what this might look like can be found in Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove's book, Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion. Jonathan is a white Christian writer and speaker from North Carolina, a member of Red Letter Christians who graduated from Duke University. In 2003, he and his wife, Leah, moved to Durham's Walltown community, a historically African-American neighborhood whose residents have maintained Duke University since its first janitor, George Wall, moved there in the 1890s. In Walltown, the Wilson Hartgroves and their children became part of an African-American Christian community that met primarily on porches, the porches of their homes. While in that community, Jonathan was discipled by Ann Atwater, an elderly black woman who had come to Haiti, the heart of Durham's African-American community, in the 1960s as a poor, young, uneducated single mother. Jonathan tells Ann's story like this. When a local organizer recognized Ann's capacity to reach everyday people, she was recruited to attend a 16-week community action training, then went to work as a community organizer. Pretty soon, she said, I was kicking butt and taking names. Miss Ann became sergeant of the local foot soldiers in Durham's civil rights movement. In 1971, the federal government sent a mediator to facilitate the desegregation of Durham's public schools. In a surprising move, the federal agent invited Ann Atwater to co-chair the process with her arch nemesis, C.P. Ellis, a local leader in the Ku Klux Klan. Hell no, she reportedly told the mediator. But soon she realized that without her participation, the Klan would have sole control of the process. I called him back and said, I'd be happy to serve as co-chair, and later recalled. Thus, the desegregation of Durham's public schools was cooled by an avowed white supremacist and a militant black activist. Over the course of their meetings, C.P. and Ann learned some things about each other. Both of their families were poor, and poor kids weren't being served well by public schools, no matter the color of their skin. History and political powers pitted black and white against each other. But when self-interest compelled C.P. and Ann to work together, they came to see how much they had in common. At the end of their public meetings, C.P. tore up his Klan card, and Ann embraced him as a brother. Jonathan's experience of community on the Walltown porches and his mentoring by Ann Atwater helped him to realize that he had inherited a false sense of superiority that suggested Christian charity meant white folks helping black people. though he further realized that he was port-sitting not for the sake of his black neighbors, but for his own sake. He realized that, quote, my decisions weren't just about me. He was moving from I to we. He wrote, I needed to learn a new kind of politics, and Ann Atwater was the teacher God gave me. When he asked her how she did what she did with folks like C.P. Ellis, she said, well, what I do is pretty simple. I listen to you until I understand what you want, then I help you get it. And when we get about halfway to what you want, I tell you what I want. When we develop covenantal relationships with God and our communities, and when possible with our opponents, it is just possible that we might move from I to we and be delivered from our current affliction.